For the third reading today, I've chosen to put together a piece from Genesis chapter 11 and from the Acts of the Apostles chapter 2. It's the story of the Tower of Babel and the story of Pentecost juxtaposed. Genesis chapter 11. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used the brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it's called a Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. And from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each one of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit, and they began to speak in tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now, there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these people Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language, Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs? We all hear them declaring the words of God and the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Words inspired by God. During my time in Kenya, I spent a few years as a headmaster of a high school. It was called Kipchimchim Harambee, a secondary school. And Harambee schools were schools which were built by the local population without any government assistance. They were self-help. So the buildings were created by the local people, and the school fees had to be paid to pay teachers' salaries, etc. And I was headmaster there for a few years. And as well as that, I taught math and physics and religion. And I remember on one occasion, I was trying to impress upon them the difficulties of translating an ancient language like Hebrew, which had been an oral tradition for hundreds of years before it was written down. And it was written in Hebrew, a language that doesn't have vowel signs. And even modern Hebrew doesn't have vowel signs. They only write the consonants. And then it is the context that determines which vowels you put between the consonants in order to make sense as you're listening and as you're reading. So it's a difficult language. Now you take that language, an ancient language going back nearly 4,000 years, no vowel signs, and now you try to translate it into, say, some of the Kenya languages that was around me. And many of these, the Kalenjin languages, had no written form. They were never written down. There was no orthography whatsoever until very, very recently. Missionaries introduced an orthography. And then they began translating the Bible into some Kenya languages. And I was trying to impress upon the students the difficulties attendant upon trying to translate an ancient language, which had been an oral tradition for hundreds of years, and then was written in a script that didn't have vowel signs, And now we're translating into a language which didn't have an orthography until recently and tried to make sense of the scriptures. And so I decided to do an experiment one day. So I took 3 students and asked them to wait outside the classroom while the rest of us were inside. And then I wrote on the blackboard, I wrote a passage, a simple passage, just a secular passage in English, maybe 4 or 5 lines. And then I brought in one of the students from outside and I asked him if he would translate the English I had just written into Swahili. Swahili is a kind of a lingua franca for East Africa. It's spoken in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and parts of Zaire, and even Rwanda. And so this kid got the piece of chalk, and he's looking at the English version, and he's translating it into Swahili. And when he was finished, I covered up the English version. And I brought in the second kid. And I asked her, I showed her the Swahili version, I said, I want you to translate that into Kipsigis for me. And I gave her a piece of chalk, and now she's writing a Kipsigis translation of the Swahili. And when she was finished, I covered up the Swahili version, and I brought in the third student. And I asked him to translate the Kipsigis into English. So he had his piece of chalk, and he's translating the Kipsigis into English. And then I uncover the original English version that I had written, and we compare it to the English version that had come through Swahili and Kipsigis and back into English. And as you can imagine, there was almost no resemblance between the 2 texts. So that's the difficulty of language, even in a written form, let alone in a verbal form. And that's the issue I want to kind of address today. I'm going to talk about language and its evolution and its importance. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. The first one I call the story of language. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the Tower of Babel, the story I just read for you from the scriptures. Then thirdly, I'm going to call Pentecost Babel Undone. And that was the Pentecost story I read for you. And then the 4th point I'll call it Pentecost in slow motion. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So in order to understand language, Homo sapiens sapiens developed language about 70,000 years ago. Before that, Homo sapiens didn't have language. You know, they had a ratiocination, intelligence, but they didn't have symbols. They couldn't manufacture symbols interiorly and make a language out of them. Only 70,000 years ago with Homo sapiens sapiens did language arrive. But in order to understand language, even oral language, we first have to understand what sound is. So I'm sure you all remember the old chestnut that asked, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? And the scientific answer is, no, it doesn't make a sound. If a tree falls in the forest, what happens is it sets up air vibrations. And depending on the frequency of the vibrations, a human being will infer or translate or interpret the vibrations as sound if it falls within a particular band of frequencies between 20 and 20,000 hertz. If it falls in that range, the human ear is constructed in such a way that it interprets those air vibrations as sound. If it's outside that range, the human ear will not even hear it. So you say, oh yeah, but what about if there are animals there? The same thing is true for animals. Every single animal species has a range of frequencies. And if the air vibrations are within that frequency band, then the animals will interpret it as sound. But if it's outside that range, the animals won't hear it either. So if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make sound? It doesn't make sound. So we have to back up then from sound as we examine language. So I believe that there are actually what I would call pre-linguistic languages. Languages that use our sensorium in order to send and receive messages to others. And I would call those kind of pre-linguistic languages. And I'll give you a few examples. So let's start with sound. So if you take, for instance, frogs croaking, or dogs barking, or whales whistling, or birds singing, or pre-verbal children vocalizing, then in some senses, you're talking about a pre-linguistic language. It's not a language per se, you know, it's sounds and vocalizations of various kinds, but it's conferring information to others. So it's, I would call it pre-linguistic language. Or you take, for instance, our sense of smell. And so, for instance, the acacia trees in East Africa that the giraffes like to eat. The giraffes with their long necks, they can reach right up to the top. When a giraffe, attacks an acacia tree, the acacia tree sends out pheromones, olfactory pheromones, to try to create a toxic odor so the giraffe won't continue to eat it. But the problem is it takes it about 15 minutes to build up a sufficient supply to turn off the giraffe. So what does it do? It sends a signal, a pheromone signal, to all of the other acacia trees in the area. There are giraffes here, be careful. And by the time the giraffe gets to the second tree, it's already created its defenses, and so the giraffe is going to stay away from it. So there now you're using smell as a kind of a language. Or you take many, many animals. When animals get into heat, they send off pheromones, and others pick up and they say, okay, one says, I'm in heat, let's talk. And the other guy arrives then, and they mate. And so you're using the sense of smell, the olfactory sense, as a communication device, as a pre-linguistic kind of language. And you take, for instance, our sight, and you look particularly at color, and you look at how birds and octopi and even flowers use colors in order to attract pollinators or mates. So in actual fact, a lot of the flowers that we see as human beings, we can't see into the ultraviolet range, but bees and pollinators can. And that's what attracts them to the flowers. So here we're using the sense of sight as a kind of a pre-linguistic language to send and interpret messages. Now you take, for instance, the sense of touch. How do we use that as a language? So for instance, a hug or a handshake is a kind of a language we use, using tactile. Or look at the Braille language of the blind. When I was a kid growing up with my parents, for about 3 years, there was a young woman that lived with us, and she was completely blind. And she'd have these huge big books. I don't know if you've ever seen these Braille, and she'd read it with her fingers. And she'd also write. There was a little stylus, kind of, that she'd punch holes through in order to write the letters. And so you can use touch as a kind of a pre-linguistic language. And so in many, many senses then, sound and sight and smell, these are kind of pre-linguistic languages. And I'm sure that we availed of these before we actually developed, real languages. And maybe the greatest expert in the 20th century, at least, the greatest linguist of the 20th century was a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swiss linguist. And he contended that language, spoken language, oral language, consists of 3 parts. The first one he called the referent, which is the object in the real world that you're trying to describe. So you're in the bush, and you see a particular creature, with big long tusks, and a long trunk or whatever. So there's the object in the real world. And now you create an image inside your own head. He called that the signified. And the signified is made up of sensory inputs. So you saw it, maybe you heard it make noise, maybe you smelt it, maybe you reached out and you touched it even. And so this creates an amalgam of images that he called the signified. And then the third piece is the signifiers, the sounds you're going to make in order to tell somebody else of the image in your head as a result of the referent in the real world. So at this stage then, depending on the language you're using, you're going to use different signifiers. If you're speaking, for instance, in English, you're going to call this, kind of a tusked pachyderm, you're going to call it an elephant. If you're speaking Swahili, you're going to call it ndovu. If you're speaking Kipsigis, you're going to call it Beliot. So you're going to call it different things. So different signifiers for the same signified, representing the same referent in the real world. So that's how oral languages develop particularly. Now, on the basis of that, I want to look then at the story of the Tower of Babel. And as I read it for you, let me outline again for you what the story is. It comes in chapter 11 of the book of Genesis, very shortly after the story of the flood. Now, a very vindictive God has already thrown our pre-rational parents out of the Garden of Eden for eating a piece of fruit. And then he wiped out all of creation because he was really, really upset. He only saved 8 people. Noah and his wife, and their 3 sons and their wives. Now, slowly, by chapter 11, the human population is beginning to pick up speed again. And at this stage, God's petulance or his jealousy breaks out again. So just as they're beginning to repopulate, he decides to do something else to create discord. So according to the story we just heard, and at this stage, God is not a single entity. God is polytheistic. So he says, let us go down. In the same way that he earlier said, let us build humans in our own image and likeness. It's a plural verb in the Hebrew, Elohim. And so at this stage now, God says, makes another decision, let's go down, and confuse their tongues. We threw them out of the garden because we were afraid they would become like us by eating the fruit of a different tree. Now we're going to scatter them in case they actually build a tower that reaches to heaven, and then they invade our place and they become like us. So once again, God is going to create discord in the people. So allegedly, all the humans that existed at that stage only spoke a single language. So now God goes down and he confuses their tongues, and then he scatters them all over the world. And now when they meet each other, they're not brothers and sisters anymore. They're enemies of each other, speaking different languages and having totally different cultures. Now, when I try to unpack this story, part of me thinks that I don't believe that it was actually a case that all human beings spoke a single language, and then God confused it, and they began to speak many, many, many languages. I have a theory, in fact, that humans didn't have language at that stage, that humans operated telepathically. There wasn't a need for language yet, that literally they communicated mind to mind. And there's some evidence for that still residing in Aboriginal peoples, particularly in Australia. So I have a theory that God's, intervened to create confusion, not by making separate languages of the one they already had, but by giving them language in the first place, in place of telepathy. So I want to look then at the notion of telepathy. What do I mean? So, for instance, we've all had telepathic kinds of experiences where you can understand suddenly what somebody else is thinking. You've got this sudden flash or this sudden insight. Or you're thinking about somebody and all of a sudden the phone rings and this person is on the other end and you haven't spoken with this person for 25 years, but you knew who it was going to be. So we all have telepathic experiences. Now, the question I ask myself is this. Could you have a telepathic exchange with somebody who speaks a different language? So if somebody speaks only, let's say, French, and I only speak Gaelic, could I have a telepathic exchange with that person? Because they don't speak my language, and I don't speak their language. So what would a telepathic exchange look like between two people who don't know each other's languages? Or in fact, I asked the question, would telepathy work if there weren't any language to begin with? So what does telepathy actually mean? So I think actually that telepathy, I would call it pre-linguistic or trans-linguistic or post-linguistic. So I believe that it's a download from mind to mind without the use of language whatsoever. We start unpacking it using language, but the download itself does not depend on language to begin with. So it's like a lot of information is exchanged without any language, and therefore without any of the problems attendant upon language, like misinformation or misinterpretation or mishearing. So when you're not using language, but you're downloading from mind to mind, none of these barriers get in the way. And when you think about languages that we speak, typical other languages, language basically consists of information bytes of information strung together into sentences and paragraphs. And information is basically, I would say, energy quanta. They're quanta of energy. And energy, I believe, is the movement of the cosmic mind, God's mind in a sense. So then, from which level does telepathy originate or operate? I personally think that it's a consciousness to consciousness, which is pre-linguistic completely. And so the problem only becomes when you've had a download and now you're trying to unpack it in some way. Now you're going to have to employ language, and now all the difficulties come in. So you lose a whole bunch of information as soon as you employ language to try to interpret the experience you've just had. So language is like trying to eat tomato soup with a fork. That's how leaky language is. And all of the mystics say the very same thing. St. Paul has a very famous statement where he says, "Eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it even entered into the human heart what things God has prepared for those who love him." Now, in some senses, Paul is saying, I can't articulate it. The eye has never seen this thing. The ear has never heard it. The heart has never felt it. Imagination could not conceive it because we're using senses and intellect, because the download is totally different. And again and again and again, the mystics say that the experience of God is ineffable. It cannot be articulated. It cannot be put into language. So when I think of the story of the Tower of Babel, that's what comes up for me. That we're not talking about one language becoming many. We're talking about telepathy being substituted by a language. And that's confusing in its own right. That's my second point. My third point then, I'm going to call Pentecost, Babel undone. So once upon a time, the world was changed radically. And it wasn't done by the politicians, and it wasn't done by the military, and it wasn't done by the priests. It was done by a carpenter, a bumbling bunch of fishermen, and a group of dedicated housewives. And we know that movement as the Jesus movement that ushered in a Christ consciousness. Now, I think the highlight of that Jesus movement was the Pentecost event. And it's significant because Pentecost is a very important feast in the Jewish calendar and was at the time. It's the festival of Shavuot, the time when Moses was given the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. And so on that occasion in Jerusalem, you know, Jews from the diaspora from all over the world would gather in Jerusalem to celebrate the Pentecost event. Now, at this stage then, according to the Acts of the Apostles, there's extraordinary downpouring of the Holy Spirit. Jesus has descended back to the heavens just 10 days beforehand. And now there's this extraordinary miracle that I just read from the Acts of the Apostles. And it's amazing because it's a miracle both for the speakers and for the listeners, because each person hears them in their own tongue, and they're scattered throughout the world. I read for you the entire list of nations from which the Jews in exile or in diaspora had come for this feast. And they're not hearing it because Peter suddenly became multilingual, but because the Spirit is translingual. They thought they were hearing with their ears, you know, and understanding with their minds, but actually they were hearing in their hearts and they were understanding with their souls. And this I would call true Spirit-tinged telepathy. And when I look at that telepathic download, what for me, you know, was the most important message of it? There are two versions of Pentecost in the Christian scriptures. The first one I read for you is from Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, from Luke. But there's another version from John, in John's Gospel, John chapter 20. And according to John's version, Pentecost happened on exactly the same day of resurrection. So there's a difference of 50 days between them. And according to this story, the disciples are hiding out because they're afraid of the religious leaders and they're locked in a room. And Jesus comes through the walls and stands in front of them and says, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. And they're still scared. They think they're seeing a ghost. So he repeats it, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. I have not come to upbraid you. You know, I'm not here to accuse you of abandoning me. I am here because I want to bring you peace. And so he breathed upon them and he said, receive the Holy Spirit. And then he said a very interesting thing. Whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven. And whose sins you shall retain, they are retained. And the Catholic Church latched onto this and claimed that this was the justification for claiming that only validly ordained Catholic priests can forgive sin or retain it and tell you, no, I can't forgive that sin. You got to go to the bishop, or even the bishop can't forgive you. It's so bad. So that's what the Catholic Church did with it. Now, for me, this, in fact, was the first mandate of the Spirit. Forgiveness is the first mandate of the Holy Spirit. In fact, it's an extraordinary psychological and sociological insight on the part of Jesus. Jesus saying, if you forgive people their sins, then they are forgiven. Not in the sense that you've shriven them and said, you know, ego te absolvo peccatis tuis, I absolve you from your sins. It's not that. It's that Jesus saying psychologically and sociologically, when you act with forgiveness and compassion, all violence begins to cease. And if you refuse to forgive and to act with compassion, then violence just takes off. And so you have the ability as individuals, and we have the ability as communities to operate out of forgiveness or out of retaining the ability to not forgive under any circumstances, to hold grudges between communities or nations or individuals. It's a sociological truth, it's a psychological truth, and more importantly than that, it's a spiritual truth. The very first gift of the Holy Spirit was the injunction to forgive each other in order that we might experience peace in our hearts, peace in our communities, and peace in our world. Anybody who's even semi-serious about their spirituality needs to realize that forgiveness is the sine qua non of spirituality, without which you cannot improve spiritually. So that would be my third point. My fourth point, I'm going to call it Pentecost in slow motion. And I'm actually going to divide this into two sections. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the brain and consciousness, the connection between brain and consciousness. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about the Hindu Pentecost, the kind of map of evolution. So let me begin with the brain. In spite of what modern science, and by modern science I'm talking about, since René Descartes separated, spirituality from science, modern science believes that the consciousness is simply an illusion created by neurochemical activity in the physical brain, this little 3-pound blob of wetware that we carry between our ears. And that's patently not true. And all of the great mystical traditions have been saying that this is not true for thousands and thousands of years. The brain does not produce consciousness. The brain is an antenna that picks up consciousness and, very importantly, limits it. The brain really limits consciousness. And I'm going to give you plenty of examples to support that contention, that the brain is just an antenna that's picking up consciousness from some kind of a cosmic consciousness, but it's limiting what it's able to hear. So you take, for instance, people who are designated autistic savants. It used to be called idiot-savants. People who have no social skills whatsoever, autistic kids, but they can be geniuses at math or music or art. Now, how can it be that a brain which is compromised so badly can have these kinds of gifts? There was an extraordinary story from Oxford University about 15 years ago. A student in Oxford University, and you have to be really the creme de la creme to get into Oxford. And moreover, to get into mathematics, he was an honours student in mathematics in Oxford University. And for some reason, he got ill and he had to have a brain scan. And when they did the brain scan, they were shocked to find this kid did not have a neocortex. The only part of a brain he had was the brain stem, the reptilian brain. There was no brain in his head. And this was an honours student in mathematics in Oxford University. There's since been a second case in the United States of a high school girl in similar circumstances, acing her classes, and then for some reason having to do a brain scan and finding out that there was almost no brain tissue, in her skull. So the brain does not create consciousness by any manner of means. It's simply an antenna. You look, for instance, at the phenomenon of what's called terminal lucidity. Very, very often it's been reported by doctors and family members that a person who's been suffering from Alzheimer's for many, many years, and then very shortly before they die, and the brain is fried at this stage, really this holes all over the physical brain. All of a sudden, in the last few hours of life, the person achieves what's called terminal lucidity. They sit up in bed and they have perfect conversations and they recognize all their family members whom they haven't recognized for maybe 10 years before that. You get the same phenomenon with people who report near-death experiences. People who've been pronounced clinically dead, which means they're not breathing, the heart is not beating, and the brain is flatlining. And still they're recording these extraordinary visionary experiences at the other side. And so it's very obvious to me that the brain does not produce consciousness. It's an antenna and a limiting factor. So it's like, I remember as small kids, when I was growing up in Ireland, we'd be listening to the radio for music and for matches, hurling and football matches. And we only basically had one channel. We could barely get BBC, but we could get what was called radio television, Irish radio. And in those days, those of you who are old enough to remember, it was a knob. You had to twist the knob and you'd hear all this squeaking before and after. And then there was this tiny slice where you could actually hear the voice or the music. And so somehow you were trying to get the ideal frequency. Now, the sending station was sending out these waves, and they weren't just in concentric circles, as if they were on a horizontal surface. They were concentric spheres. It was going in all directions simultaneously. And the little antenna was picking up a frequency, and you turned the knob, and then you could hear what was happening. But we didn't have a whole choice. Now we have more choices. But there's still a whole bunch of stuff that we're not picking up. And so consciousness is much bigger than the little antenna that we carry between our ears can pick up. So it becomes really important then to realize that as we talk about, you know, the evolution of our world and the future of science and the future of humanity. So we take the second part of that last point then. So I'm going to call this part the Hindu Pentecost. And for me, it's a map of our evolution. It's a description of who we really are, and it's also a map of our evolution. And I've presented this many, many, many times. It's the Hindu notion of the 7 levels of the body. And so at the most basic level, you know, vibrating between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers, between infrared and ultraviolet, is this physical body of ours. Now, it's a space suit. And so it's like, in fact, sometimes it's more like a suit of armor. And at death, we step outside of the suit of armor. So you imagine somebody, you know, in the 1500s, you know, a knight going into battle on his horse with his lance. And then at the end, you know, he goes home and he strips off the helmet and he takes off the breastplate and he steps out of the pants and he goes out in the front lawn and he runs free. So that's what it's like when we step out of this suit of armor that's called the physical body. That's the first level of body according to Hinduism. The second level, they call the etheric or the energy body. Now, I think this is what would be called vitalism. It's this energy that courses through the system, the kind of the innate life force. And I believe it is the secret to ancient, you know, traditional medicines of all kind. It's the secret to Ayurveda. It's the secret to Chinese medicine. It's the secret to homeopathy. They're dealing with the basic energy of the system. And that's where diseases begin. And that's where you can intervene most efficiently to work with diseases that happen. Not vaccinations, not medications, but trying to build an immunity by nurturing the vitalism, this energy built into the system by God herself. So that would be the second level of body. It's vibrating at a higher frequency. We don't normally get to see it, except some people can see auras. When you see the aura, you're actually looking at the energy body. And the energy body in some senses is like the blueprint on your computer, of which the physical body is just a printout or a hard copy. So the second level then will be the etheric body. The third level then they call the astral body. And the astral body now, it transcends time and space and causation. It's the place that your emotions come from. It's the place, according to Hinduism, that you actually download all of the experiences of the lifetime just ending when the physical body dies. And you're going to pick those back up when you reincarnate. Now, in that space, we've gone beyond, you know, science. We've gone beyond space and time and causation. And you've all experienced this in your dream life, because dreams come at the astral body level as well. And so, for instance, I've shared this dream with you. Sometime in the early 1990s, when I'm living here in the States, I had a dream of my grandfather, Daddy Jim. And in my dream, I'm in my childhood home in Mayfield in County Cork in 1956. So I've gone back almost 50 years. And I've crossed 6,000 miles of a continent and an Atlantic Ocean, and I'm with my grandfather then. So there's no time and there's no space when you get to the astral level of the self. You're in timelessness and spacelessness, because you're literally traveling at the speed of light, which is what Einstein predicted, that at the speed of light, the space shrinks to zero and time shrinks to zero. We experience that every night in our dream life. This is what they're telling us in Hinduism. And then the fourth level up is what they call the mental body or the mind body. And this is like Plato's ideal realm. It's the place of ratiocination. It's the place in which we download all great ideas. And I would say that is the place from which intuition and inspiration and creativity flow. It's from that level of the self that these great downloads happening. So it's like we're channeling stuff which is not our own. We're being inspired from something. It's not that we're creating something new, it's that we're channeling something which exists in cosmic consciousness. And all of you have had this experience. I remember when I wrote the Eucharistic Prayer of the Cosmos, it was in May 2007, and we were just about to celebrate the 10th anniversary of COJ, and we were talking about trying to bring our liturgy, and our theology together, because the theology, that I was preaching was very different from the liturgy that we were conducting. And so I wrote this, and it took me 1.5 hours to write the entire thing. I sat down at my desk, I barely lifted the pen from the paper, and the whole thing flowed out, because I knew I wasn't creating it. I was simply tapping into the cosmic consciousness in some way, and I was downloading what already existed. So we've all experienced that. In fact, quantum mechanics tells us precisely that. Quantum mechanics tells us that we're not creating, realities, we're selecting realities. That the observer effect in quantum mechanics is the realization that the observer collapses the wave of all possibilities down to the discrete particle outcome. And so it's the observation and the attention and the focus that we give that actually creates the connection. Now, beyond that, then the fifth level, according to Hinduism, is they call it the causal body. Sometimes they call it the psychic body. And this is the place where we really experience, in my belief, we experience telepathy and precognition and psychokinesis and clairvoyance and clairaudience and clairsentience. For the simple reason that at that stage, we're embedded in a field of consciousness. It's that we're not separate entities anymore. We're embedded in the field of consciousness itself. And that's why John Bell can talk about entanglement theory, that all of nature is embedded in that field of consciousness. And like a rising tide lifts all of the boats, when we're in that space, we're all connected. Everybody is connected in that field. The sixth level, they will call the soul, which is kind of a fractal of source itself. And then ultimately there's source itself. And I would say that source is much more than mere cosmic consciousness. When I think of cosmic consciousness, I think that only that amount of intelligence that was necessary to create and sustain and evolve a particular universe, I would call that cosmic consciousness, but that is not source. That is not God. That's just a particular manifestation or a work of source. So consciousness is much, much greater than cosmic consciousness. Cosmic consciousness is simply that amount of intelligence that source uses to create and sustain and evolve a particular universe or particular universes. So my belief then is that Pentecost continues. It's Pentecost in slow motion. This journey back to source is Pentecost in slow motion. The question then becomes, with what level of this Hindu model are you identified? Are you identified simply with the physical part of it? Are you identified with, the energy of the system? And when you think about the Pentecost of Jesus, where he said, whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven, and whose sins you shall retain, they are retained, as a psychological, a sociological, and a spiritual teaching and deep insight, are you taking that seriously? Where is that informing your worldview? Where is that informing your relationships? Where is that informing your interpretation of world events right now? Because each of us is either contributing to Pentecost in slow motion or we're impeding it. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.